The town of Elmswood stirred to life slowly, like a kettle left on the back of the stove, warming without ever quite boiling. Dust lingered over the unpaved streets, rising gently with the early hoofbeats of horses and the wooden rattle of wagon wheels. The sky over the town was a pale, patient blue, cloudless and wide. In this quiet corner of the frontier, things didn't change quickly, and the people liked it that way. Clara Bennett opened her shutters to the morning light, her fingers quick and practiced. The air was brisk, even in early spring, and she breathed it in as if to fill herself with something clean and solid before the day began. Her cottage sat just at the edge of town, a modest clapboard house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. It was nothing to boast about, but it was hers, paid for in full before life taught her what it meant to grieve without warning. She tied her hair into a low bun and reached for her teaching satchel, already packed the night before with reading primers and ink-stained attendance logs. Breakfast was plain, half a biscuit from the previous day and a small cup of coffee, brewed weak to make it last. As she took careful bites, she looked over at the photograph on her mantel. Her late husband Daniel smiled in that frozen way. Photographs always caught him, unsure, but trying. He had been gone 3 years now. The first year the town had treated her gently. The second, she was expected to move on. By the third, the kindness had grown thin, worn down by the smallness of the town and the whispers that followed any woman who stood too long alone. At precisely 7, Clara stepped out the door, her boots clicking softly on the wooden steps. She walked with a straight back, her posture that of someone who knew the world was watching, even if it pretended not to care. She passed the Mercantile, where old Mrs. Langley stood sweeping the front steps, offering only a faint nod as Clara walked by. At the barber's window, 2 men glanced up from their seats, muttering something under their breath that Clara chose not to hear. She reached the schoolhouse before most of her students, save for little Thomas Pike, who always arrived early. He stood by the door with a book too large for his hands, his freckled nose buried deep in Chapter 2 of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. "Good morning, Thomas," Clara said gently, unlocking the schoolhouse door. "Morning, Miss Bennett," he said without looking up. "I think Tom's about to get himself in trouble again." "Sounds about right," she replied, smiling softly as she pushed open the creaky door. Inside, the schoolhouse smelled of old wood, ink, and dust. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, pooling on the wide plank floor and painting the rows of desks in gold. Clara lit the stove in the corner, set out slates for the younger children, and began writing the day's lessons on the board. She didn't need to reference a book. Her mind held every lesson plan, every schedule, every student's struggle and strength. She had built her days into this routine, steady as clockwork. One by one, the children arrived, some in neatly patched clothes, others barefoot and wild-haired. They greeted her with grins, mumbled good mornings, and a few shy glances from the older boys who didn't know quite what to make of her anymore. She taught with a voice clear and steady, never raising it unless she must, and never needing to more than once. Arithmetic before lunch, reading after, history when the energy dipped, and storytelling before the final bell. She watched their faces as they listened, some bright with interest, others glassy-eyed with hunger. When lunchtime came, she gave her apple to Ruthie, the girl who never had enough, and turned her attention to checking their penmanship instead of eating. Outside the schoolhouse, the wind stirred up grit and gossip. The townsfolk of Elmswood had long memories and sharper tongues. Clara heard the things they said when they thought she wasn't listening, that she was too proud, that she thought herself better because she used words like elocution and temperance, that she was a burden, a leftover, a woman who should have remarried by now if she wanted to be respectable. But Clara didn't want another man to fix her life. She wanted to build something from the pieces left behind. She had turned down more than one offer, some kind, some not so, and each refusal had cost her a little more favor, a little more trust, which was why the attention from Marshall Crowley felt so strange. He was a man used to being noticed, tall and silver-tongued, with eyes that missed nothing and hands that had never seen a day's work. He owned half the town, land, cattle contracts, even a stake in the post office. He was aiming for a state seat in the coming elections, though he'd never said it outright. Men like him didn't have to say their ambitions. They simply watched others move out of the way. He started visiting the schoolhouse. At first, under the pretense of donating supplies. A new set of chalk. A globe. Later, he brought her a silk ribbon from a catalog back east, insisting it would bring out her eyes. She thanked him politely and never wore it. He stood too close when he spoke, always smiling, always asking questions that had more weight than they appeared to. One afternoon, Clara stepped out to fetch water and found a bouquet of fresh-cut lilies sitting on the front step. No note, but none was needed. Crawley stood across the road, hat in hand, nodding at her with a grin too wide to be anything but performative. The town began to take notice. Mrs. Langley stopped nodding altogether. Children whispered in the back of the classroom. And yet, Crawley only became more forward. He spoke loudly in the general store, praising Clara's strength and grace. He tipped his hat to her with a flourish, even when she turned away. He started walking her home after school, talking about progress and politics, the future, and the need for strong women to stand beside strong men. Clara listened but said little. She didn't trust men who talked too much about strength. Still, there was pressure, unspoken, but there. She saw the way others watched them, the way the school board members raised their eyebrows, how the town banker offered her a discount on her mortgage, suddenly eager to please. But Clara could still feel the weight of Daniel's absence, and not just in her bones. In the silence at night, in the way no one else had understood her laughter, she wasn't ready. And even if she had been, she doubted Marshall Crowley was the kind of man who saw her for who she truly was. He saw something polished, a teacher's image, something he could hold up in front of others as if to say, "Look what belongs to me." One evening, as she sat by the fire grading arithmetic papers, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Crowley standing there with a wrapped parcel. "A gift," he said. "Thought you might wear it next Sunday." She unwrapped it slowly. A sky-blue dress, fine cotton, stitched with care. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, though her heart sank. "Then it'll suit you just fine," he said, stepping forward. "And Clara, might I call on you more formally? I believe we could be good for each other." She didn't answer right away. The flames crackled behind her, and outside, the wind shifted through the mesquite trees. "I appreciate your kindness," she said carefully, "but I'm not ready, and I value what little I have. My work, my home. I won't trade them for fine things." Crawley's smile faltered, just a flicker. "Think on it," he said, and tipped his hat. She watched him leave, the dress still folded in her arms. She didn't wear it that Sunday, or any Sunday after. And though she kept walking to school each morning, though she kept teaching with the same gentle resolve, something in the town had shifted. Eyes followed her with sharper judgment. Gossip turned bitter. And Clara, though never broken, began to brace herself for what she sensed was coming. The bell rang out across the town square, its sharp metallic clang slicing through the quiet of the morning like a knife. Clara stood frozen at the church steps, her fingers clasped neatly at her waist, the fabric of her best dress stiff with starch and heat. The air was thick, the kind that made breath feel like work, and yet no one moved. They watched her. Just moments before, Marshall Crowley had stood beside her, tall, polished, every part the man he wanted the town to admire. He had spoken loud enough for the congregation to hear, his voice firm, confident, almost rehearsed. "I had thought," he said, "that a woman like Miss Bennett would value the opportunity to join a respectable man in building something greater. But it seems my judgment was flawed." The silence that followed was more deafening than any shout. Then came the murmurs, small, sharp words like thorns brushing against skin. Clara stood still, blinking against the sunlight, her mouth dry and her pulse loud in her ears. Crowley gave a slight nod, tipped his hat, not to her, but to the crowd, and walked away with long strides. his boots clicking on the stone steps, as though he hadn't just shattered a woman's name in front of her neighbors. She didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of them. She simply turned and walked back down the steps, her head high, her spine straight, each movement deliberate. Inside, however, her stomach curled, her throat burned, and shame clung to her skin like sweat. Children who had once waved at her now glanced away. Parents who once praised her now avoided her eye. The bouquet she had received a week ago still sat on her mantel, wilted and brown. She meant to throw it out, but some strange defiance kept it there, proof that at least once someone had seen value in her, even if only for show. At the schoolhouse, her desk felt colder than usual. The morning passed in a blur. The students arrived quieter than usual, eyes darting from their slates to her face and back again. Some seemed worried, others confused. At recess, a group of older girls stood whispering by the water pump, casting sideways glances until Clara stepped out, and they scattered. By Friday, 5 children had been withdrawn. Parents offered flimsy excuses: a family illness, a move to another county, a cousin who could teach at home. Clara didn't argue. She simply marked the absences and folded their names quietly from the register. Her evenings became lonelier. The townsfolk had grown distant before, but now they avoided her altogether. No more nods in passing. No more casual greetings. Her weekly stop at the general store felt like walking into a room where she didn't belong. The clerk, a boy no older than 17, wouldn't meet her eyes. Mrs. Langley, once her elder in both years and attitude, turned her back with the grace of a woman trained in silent scorn. Clara found herself speaking less, only to the children, and even then, only what was needed. The world had shrunk to the size of her classroom and her cottage, and in both places she moved like a shadow, trying not to disturb the living. Then came the rain. It began on a Wednesday, the kind of storm that rolls in low and angry, smothering the sun beneath its weight. By noon, the sky was dark, and the wind howled like a mourning widow through the schoolhouse windows. She dismissed the children early, handing out coats, buttoning collars, and walking them to the edge of the yard. Most ran home under umbrellas or held tight to older siblings. By 3, only Clara remained, her own coat thin, the hem damp from where it brushed the floor. She gathered her things, locked the door, and started the walk home. The path curved around a low hill, muddy and slick from the downpour. Her boots slipped more than once, but she kept going, shielding her satchel beneath her coat. She didn't see the rut. Her foot caught, her ankle twisted, and she fell hard, her knees striking gravel, palms scraping open. For a moment she stayed down, the rain pounding against her shoulders, her skirt soaked through. She tasted blood at the corner of her mouth, and still, she didn't cry. But she did stay there longer than she should have, unable to will herself up. A horse snorted behind her. She turned her head, blinking through the water. A wagon had stopped beside her. A tall figure stepped down, broad-shouldered, worn coat, boots thick with mud. His voice was soft but firm. "You all right, Miss Bennett?" Clara blinked again. Eli Thompson stood above her, a concerned crease between his brows. She tried to rise, but her ankle gave under her weight. He reached out without a word and helped her to her feet, his grip warm and calloused. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her face betrayed the lie. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding toward her hand. "It's nothing. I'll take you home." "There's no need." "It's not a question." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. He helped her into the wagon with surprising care, guiding her hand to the side rail and supporting her weight without rushing her. Once seated, she adjusted her coat, shivering as the wind cut through the wet fabric. He climbed back onto the seat, gave a soft click to the reins, and the horse began moving again, hooves splashing through the mud. They rode in silence for a long time, save for the rain. It pattered against the canvas overhead, a steady rhythm like a lullaby. "I heard what happened," Eli said finally, his voice low. Clara stared at the road ahead. "I'm sure everyone has." "You didn't deserve that." She glanced at him. His eyes stayed on the trail, his jaw tight. "You don't even know me," she said softly. "I know enough," he replied. They didn't speak the rest of the way, but when they reached her cottage, he stepped down first, offered her his arm, and helped her to the door. She reached for the latch, then paused. "Thank you." He nodded once, tipping his hat. Then he turned and walked back to the wagon, the horse already restless in the cold. That night, Clara sat by the fire, her knees bandaged and her fingers wrapped in cloth. The heat of the flames did little to warm her chest. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see Crowley's smirk or the judging stares of the town. She saw a man in a weathered coat, silent but steady, offering his hand without condition. The next morning, a small bundle sat on her porch. A jar of salve, a roll of fresh bandages, and a note in neat, careful handwriting. "For the days that try to knock you down, E.T." She folded the note into her journal and said nothing to anyone. But that afternoon, she added a book to the classroom shelf, Legends of the Frontier, bound in worn leather and smelling of tobacco. No one saw where it came from. And when Thomas Pike asked if they could start learning about local history, Clara only smiled and said, "Yes, I think it's time." The wind that morning came from the north, cold and clear, sweeping through Elmswood like a broom through a dusty hallway. Clara stepped out onto her porch, wrapped in a wool shawl, a small tin cup of tea steaming in her hands. The bruises on her knees had begun to fade, and the cuts on her palms no longer stung when she held chalk or tied her apron. But something inside her still ached, something deeper than injury, closer to the heart. She looked out at the empty road. The town remained still. It was early yet. A few distant roosters called from behind the hills, and smoke curled from the chimneys near the general store. The quiet of the hour had always brought her peace, but lately it brought questions. She had spent her life building a place here, through grief, through scorn, through whispered rumors, but for the first time she wondered if staying had been a mistake. There were other towns, other schools, but then she thought of her students, Thomas and Ruthie and the little Henderson twins who couldn't keep their letters straight, and her heart reminded her why she stayed. By the time she reached the schoolhouse, the sun had crept above the cottonwoods. Light dusting of frost shimmered on the ground, making the earth look like it had tried to snow and lost the will halfway through. Clara lit the stove, opened the windows to air out the lingering damp, and began setting the day's lessons. She had just finished chalking out a math problem when a knock came at the door. She turned, expecting a student or perhaps a parent with more bad news, but it was neither. Eli Thompson stood there, a small wooden crate in his arms. "Good morning," he said, shifting the box to one side. Clara blinked, startled. "Good morning. I brought something," he said, "not sure if it's useful." She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "Come in." The schoolhouse felt warmer with him inside, though the fire had barely caught. He placed the crate on her desk and removed the top. Inside were books, old, worn, but lovingly kept. Titles ranged from geography to stories of the prairie, some with dog-eared corners and pencil notes in the margins. "They were my wife's," he said quietly. "She taught me to read, kept every book we ever found. I thought maybe someone else should use them." Clara ran her fingers along the spines. "They're beautiful. They deserve more than dust." "Thank you," he nodded, eyes drifting toward the classroom windows. "I'll let you get to it." "Would you like some tea?" she asked before she could stop herself. He hesitated. "I wouldn't mind." She poured him a cup from her small pot behind the desk, still warm from earlier. They stood quietly, sipping from mismatched cups, letting the moment unfold without pressure. Outside, the town bustled into motion. Wagons creaked, dogs barked, men called to one another across the square. But in that room, everything slowed. Eli glanced at the chalkboard. "Division?" "Long division," Clara said. "They hate it." "Who doesn't?" She smiled, a real one this time. "You're welcome to stay and learn with them." He chuckled. "You'd regret that fast." "I doubt it." Before he could reply, the front door creaked open, and in came Thomas, eyes wide with curiosity. He stopped short at the sight of Eli. "Mr. Thompson?" the boy said, confused. "Morning, Thomas," Eli replied. Clara stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson brought us some books." Thomas peered into the crate. "Are any about horses?" Eli leaned over. "There's one about wild mustangs in Wyoming. You'll like that one." The boy's grin spread across his face like sunrise. As more students arrived, Clara felt something shift. There was no whispering today, no strange glances. Eli didn't hurry out. He stayed long enough to stack the books neatly on a shelf and nod once more before stepping outside. Clara watched him go, something warm blooming behind her ribs. That evening, as she swept the classroom floor, she found a note tucked between the books he had brought. "If you ever need anything, fixing, lifting, hauling, send a word. I'm not far." Signed with the same initials, E.T. She placed it in her ledger just behind the attendance records, where no one would find it but her. The next few days unfolded like early spring, quiet but promising. Eli came by again on Friday, this time with a repaired desk leg and a jar of preserved peaches. He said little, but Clara didn't mind. The silence between them felt like a blanket, not a wall. The townsfolk noticed. Mrs. Langley narrowed her eyes when she saw Clara and Eli speaking outside the mercantile. Mr. Dale, the banker, commented loudly about certain people getting too familiar. Even the pastor's wife whispered during service, her voice low but sharp. Clara ignored them, or tried to. One afternoon, while leaving the butcher's, she found a note pinned to her parcel of meat. "Trading one man's money for another's back fence, are you?" There was no signature, just cruel script, meant to sting. She burned the note that night, but it didn't stop the cold in her chest. The next morning, Eli showed up with a small bundle of fence posts in his wagon. "Thought your back fence was sagging," he said. She didn't argue. Instead, she made him coffee and sat with him on the porch as he explained how to set the posts deeper in the ground. His voice was calm, patient, steady. He talked about wood grain, knots, termites, the kind of talk that might bore someone else. But to Clara, it felt like music. "Why are you helping me?" she asked after a long silence. He looked at her then, straight and clear. "Because you don't deserve to be alone in this town. And because I want to." She didn't answer, just nodded, her throat tight. The rumors didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. But Clara stopped listening. Or rather, she listened less and lived more. She returned to teaching with new fire, reading aloud stories about underdogs and heroes who stood alone. She taught geography with maps donated by Eli, and read from books that had once belonged to a woman who had loved a quiet man with dirt on his hands and wisdom in his silences. One late afternoon, Clara visited Eli's ranch. It was a small place, but tidy. The barn leaned slightly to the west, and the roof needed patching, but the land rolled out behind it like a painting. Horses grazed lazily in the distance, and a dog barked once before disappearing behind the porch. Eli stood near the corral, hammering a nail into a gate. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Thought I'd bring back the book Thomas borrowed," she said. "Did he finish it?" Twice. They stood side by side, watching the wind move the grass. "My wife used to say," Eli began, "that books were doors, not just to other places, but to people." Clara turned to him. She was right. He looked at her. "You've opened a few doors yourself." She didn't know what to say, but she stayed, longer than she meant to, until the sun slipped behind the ridge, and the world turned gold. When she finally turned to leave, Eli said quietly, "You can come back, anytime." And Clara, heart-pounding, said, "I will." The morning of the town meeting broke clear and silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Frost edged every rooftop, each fence post, every narrow window pane in Elmswood. But the cold did not bite as sharply as the tension building in the hearts of those who had heard the news. It had spread fast, too fast for it to be anything but intentional. Clara Bennett's school, some whispered, was under review, not for academic reasons, not for low enrollment, but for conduct. Morality, they said. Influence. Associations. By mid-morning, the town square was stirring with activity. Men polished their boots, women pressed hats to their heads, and the children, those not kept home, stood in huddles, whispering to each other as they watched adults pass with tight jaws and narrowed eyes. The schoolhouse remained closed. Clara, having received a sealed letter the night before from the town council, had no choice but to suspend classes for the day. She sat at her kitchen table, the letter spread before her like a death sentence. Her fingers hovered over it again and again, but she already knew every word. It was formal, dressed in polite phrases, but the meaning was sharp and clear. Her behavior, it said, had come under scrutiny. Her associations, specifically with one Eli Thompson, were seen by some as questionable. The children, they wrote, were impressionable. The town had concerns. It wasn't signed by Marshal Crowley, but the weight of his hand was all over it. She stared at the letter until the print blurred. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and stood. Her dress was plain, her shawl thick, and her boots scuffed from the gravel path that led between the schoolhouse and her home. But her spine was straight, and her steps were even. Eli was already waiting for her outside. He didn't speak, only tipped his hat and offered his arm. She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. They walked in silence, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, the wind tugging gently at Clara's hem. The town hall stood at the far end of Main Street, a modest building with flaking paint and a single iron bell above the door. The benches inside were nearly full when they arrived. Men in coats too fine for their means. Women holding handkerchiefs in their laps as though expecting a funeral. Clara recognized every face. She had taught some of them. Their children sat in her classroom just weeks ago. Now those same faces turned as she entered, not with welcome, but with a guarded curiosity. Eli stayed at the back, near the door, his arms folded across his chest. Clara walked forward alone, stepping past the stares, the whispers, until she stood before the council table. 3 men sat behind it. Mr. Harlan, the grocer's cousin from over in Pine Bluff, Reverend Stokes, who had once praised her sermons when Daniel was still alive, and finally, Mr. Crowley himself, seated at the center with his hands folded neatly over the very letter she had read the night before. "Miss Bennett," Harlan began, his voice thick and neutral, "we appreciate your attendance." Clara said nothing. She did not nod. She simply waited. Reverend Stokes cleared his throat. "You understand why you've been asked here today?" "I understand I've been accused of something," Clara replied, her voice steady. "Though I've yet to be told what, exactly." There was a rustle of movement behind her. Eli did not move. He stood like a tree, silent, immovable. Crowley leaned forward slightly. "This isn't an accusation, Miss Bennett. It's an inquiry. An attempt to maintain the standards this community holds dear. An inquiry into my personal life? Into your influence," he said smoothly. "Into whether your entanglements are suitable for someone in a position of guidance over our children." Clara didn't flinch. "And what, precisely, is unsuitable about accepting help from a kind man with a good heart?" "Kindness is not what's being questioned," Crowley said. "Judgment is." A murmur passed through the room. Harlan shifted in his seat. "There are concerns. You've been seen with Mr. Thompson on several occasions." "Helping repair a schoolhouse," she replied. "Donating books, bringing firewood so my students could stay warm." "You also dined with him," Crowley added, "in private." Clara let the silence hang before she responded. "And if I had been a widow with a banker calling, or a pastor, or a councilman like yourself, would this conversation still be happening?" The room tensed. No one answered. "My work," Clara said, her voice rising only slightly, "has never been about impressing you or anyone else here. It's been about children, their minds, their future. You come here to talk about morality, but you've let politics silence voices and punish dignity. I have taught your sons, your daughters. I have fed them when they had no lunch, stayed late when they struggled, and built a place of learning without asking for more than basic respect. And now, Because a man you don't control cares enough to lend me kindness, you're ready to erase all of that?" Crawley leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You speak boldly, Miss Bennett." "I speak truthfully," she said, "because I have nothing else to lose." The hush in the room was thick. Even the children outside had stopped whispering. Crawley lifted the letter from the table, then paused, as if expecting something. That was when Eli stepped forward. His boots struck the wooden floor like thunder. 1, 2, 3 paces forward until he stood at Clara's side. "I have something to say," he said, and though his voice was soft, it cut through the hall like a blade. Harlan opened his mouth, but Eli didn't wait for permission. "This woman," he said, motioning to Clara, "has done more good than anyone else I've met in this town. She's honest, she's strong, and she cares more about your children than some of you ever have. I helped her because I believe in her. I care for her. And if that makes her unfit to teach, then maybe it's not her character you should be questioning." The silence was complete. "I buried a wife," Eli continued, eyes steady. "So did she bury a husband. We have walked through grief, through silence, through shame. And we're still here. That ought to count for something." Stokes looked down. Harlan scratched his cheek. Crowley said nothing. Clara looked over at Eli. His hand found hers, not showy, not for effect, but with quiet strength. "I will not resign," Clara said. "And I will not apologize for being treated with respect." The meeting ended without a vote, without a verdict. But as they left the building, the silence behind them told its own story. Outside, a few parents stood waiting. One, the mother of Ruthie, stepped forward and placed her hand gently on Clara's shoulder. "We'll see you Monday," she said softly, "with both my girls." Others nodded. Some smiled. One man clapped Eli on the shoulder without a word. Clara and Eli walked home together, side by side, the sun low in the sky. That night, in the quiet of her kitchen, she placed the letter in the fire and watched it burn. And across town, behind shuttered windows, even those who disapproved could no longer deny what they had seen. Something was changing. And it had begun with a woman who stood up and a man who stood beside her. The frost melted sooner that spring, not just from the sun's return, but from the warmth that seemed to ripple out from the schoolhouse each morning. Children returned in pairs and trios, their laughter again echoing down the narrow roads of Elmswood. Clara watched them through the tall windows, one hand resting over her chest as if to still the steady drum of disbelief beating there. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the town meeting, and while whispers hadn't vanished entirely, the weight of judgment had lifted. Eli visited more often, not always with tasks in mind. Sometimes he brought spare eggs, other times cut wood, and once a sewing tin she hadn't mentioned needing, but that he somehow knew she lacked. Their conversations were still quiet, but something inside them had softened. It was no longer just gratitude or shared loneliness. There was something else, something unspoken and slow-burning. One Saturday morning, Clara stood beneath the cottonwoods near the schoolyard, her arms crossed as she studied the sagging garden bed beside the fence. It had once been filled with herbs for her students to learn their names, but the soil had dried, the border had collapsed, and only weeds remained. Eli approached from behind, a small sack over his shoulder. He looked at the neglected patch, then at Clara. "I brought seeds," he said. Clara turned, startled, then smiled faintly. "You must read minds." "No, just faces." They worked together in the dirt for hours, breaking up the old soil, pulling weeds, laying new wood to mark the edge. Eli rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms darkened by sun and streaked with scars from years of labor. Clara wore a straw hat that shadowed her brow, but every now and then she would lift her gaze and find his waiting. When the bed was finished and the first rows had been planted, carrots, mint, a few early beans, Clara stood back and wiped her hands on her skirt. "I'd forgotten how good it feels to fix something," she said. Eli looked at the garden. "Sometimes you just need to start over." Clara looked at him, then nodded. Sometimes. The weeks stretched forward like a well-made path. Sundays were quieter now. She stopped attending church altogether, choosing instead to spend the mornings on her porch or walking the perimeter of the schoolhouse grounds. It was during one of these walks that she found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the doorframe. There was no name, just 4 words scribbled in heavy pencil. "She's not your kind." She read it twice, then a third time, before crumpling it in her fist. She didn't tell Eli, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to feed the flames of those who couldn't stand to see happiness in another's hands. She burned the paper like the first letter, watching the fire curl around it until it turned to ash. But when Eli saw her the next day, he noticed the shadows beneath her eyes. "Something happened?" he asked. She looked up from her desk. "No," she said. "Not anything that can't be forgotten." He didn't press, but his eyes didn't leave hers for a long moment. That afternoon, a group of children ran into the schoolhouse shouting about the spring fair, a yearly tradition that brought vendors, musicians, and townsfolk together in the square for a full day of noise, ribbons, and pie contests. Clara had not attended since Daniel passed, preferring to spend the day in solitude. But this year, Ruthie grabbed her hand and said, "Please come, Miss Bennett. You always say stories are better when you're part of them." She hesitated, then nodded. The fair arrived on a warm Saturday, sunlight falling through the clouds like coins through fingers. Booths lined the main road, and flags danced above the rooftops. Music played from the platform near the courthouse steps, and the smell of roasting corn and sugared apples filled the air. Clara wore a pale green dress she hadn't touched in over a year. She braided her hair down her back and pinned a small silver brooch at her collar. Daniel's, once, but now hers. She walked into the crowd with careful steps, unsure what welcome would await her. What she found instead were smiles. Thomas waved at her from the pie booth. Ruthie ran to grab her hand and tugged her toward the game stalls. Several parents nodded politely, and one even handed her a bouquet of spring daisies. No one mentioned Eli. No one mentioned the meeting. There were still shadows in some eyes, but they no longer moved to block her sun. Then she saw him. Eli stood near the livestock corral, his sleeves rolled, one hand resting on the flank of a chestnut mare. His eyes found hers instantly, and his mouth curved into a slow smile that reached all the way to his eyes. She walked toward him, pausing only once to nod at a passing merchant. "You came," he said. "I did." "You look," he stopped, his brow furrowing. "You look like spring came early." She laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "And you look like you've been talked into something." He grimaced slightly. "Ruthie made me promise to try the pie contest." "Did you bake?" "No," he said. "But apparently I'm judging." She tilted her head. "How fair of them." "I told her I like your cornbread best." She said that didn't count. They stood side by side again, watching the crowd move like a living river through the square. Clara felt the press of his presence like sunlight on her shoulder. Never too much, but always there. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. They wandered through the fair, past children running wild with ribbons, past the fiddlers tapping out quick reels on the edge of the platform. They stopped at the lemonade stand, shared a small jar of cider, and laughed at a young boy who managed to dunk the mare in the water tank 3 times in a row. No one whispered. No one stared. When the music shifted to something slower, older, familiar, Clara felt a tap on her wrist. "Would you?" Eli asked, extending his hand. She looked at the small gathering of dancers, then back at him. "I haven't danced in years." "Me neither." She placed her hand in his. They moved slowly, carefully, finding rhythm the way one finds breath after a long silence. Around them, others danced too, but Clara saw only Eli. His hand at her back was steady, warm. His eyes didn't roam. He held her like someone who had waited patiently for permission to feel joy again, and who would never take it for granted. When the music faded, she stepped back slightly, breath-catching. "I should go," she said softly. "I've stayed longer than I meant." Eli nodded, though his eyes told a different story. "I'll walk you." They said little on the way back, but when they reached her porch, Clara turned to face him. "I used to believe love was one thing," she said. "A fire, something fast and wild. And now?" She looked down, then up again. "Now I think it might be this instead. A steady hand, a quiet voice, something that grows without asking permission." Eli stepped closer. "Then, let me keep growing it." She didn't answer with words. She reached for his hand instead. And in that stillness, under the cottonwood tree that had watched her walk alone so many times before, Clara finally let herself be held, not because she needed it, but because she wanted it. That night the stars seemed to hang lower, like lanterns gently swinging in approval. And somewhere between the rustle of wind and the distant laughter still echoing from town, a new chapter began. "This isn't winning, Mr. Crowley," she said. "It's choosing to stay kind, choosing to keep going, choosing love when it would have been easier to give up." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. It was the kind of truth that didn't ask for applause. It just stood there, unshaken, like the woman who spoke it. If this story stirred your heart, imagine what else awaits. Don't miss more powerful tales of resilience, romance, and redemption from the untamed frontier. Subscribe now to Wild West Love Chronicles and saddle up for more unforgettable love stories under the open sky.